very much my pleasure now to welcome my co-speaker, Frances Cook, who's our investment editor of Business Desk, and she's going to facilitate our session now with our CEOs who represent regulator, banking, insurance and KiwiSaver. So I'd very much like to welcome Samantha Barrass from the FMA to come forward, Antonia Watson, CEO of ANZ, Hugh Stevens from Smartshares and Rhiannon McKinnon from Kiwi Wealth. Again, please use Slido for your questions. These panellists are going to talk about their money stories, their money journey, and then what we as an industry can do together, collaborating to move this forward, but also they're going to answer your individual questions. So welcome everybody.
Thank you so much for coming in, everyone. I hope you're all well caffeinated. The coffee out there is glorious, and this should be a really interesting session here with our industry leaders, talking about what we can all do as we head into work every day, and we hope to shift that dial on women's financial well-being. So thank you guys for coming to talk to us about this. Let's start with you, Samantha. I mean, early money memories. Yeah, I know. Always want to be the first up, don't you? Yeah. Early money memories. How did you first start handling money? How was it talked about in your home?
Okay. I mean, I grew up in a family that didn't actually have much money. When we emigrated to New Zealand when I was a little girl, both my parents had left school without any qualifications, and so they worked very hard, but money was very tight. But it was always talked about a lot around the table, and one of my early memory, very very similar to the minister actually, was that despite the fact that we were one of the less well-off families in South Brighton, in Christchurch, where I grew up, I was given more pocket money than the kids that I was in school with. But I was told that I was being given more pocket money, not so I could go out and spend it on sweets or Womble dolls or things that I might want. It was because I needed to, through the year, pay for my stationery, pay for my school trips, any of the other things that I might want to do, but particularly, unlike the other kids, my parents would not be paying for the stationery or the school trips or any of the other things that were requirement, the other things that came along during the course of the school year. And what I needed to do, and I was 8 when this happened, and what I needed to do was to make sure with my squirrel saving account, I needed to make sure that I was saving enough money so that I was running a budget through the year. And I made loads of mistakes when I first started, and I occasionally needed to borrow money from my parents to keep me going. But it taught me, it taught me and instilled in me, it's kind of like part of my DNA, saving, budgeting, living within your means. That's absolutely stayed with me to this day.
That's a lot for an 8-year-old.
Yeah.
I don't think as an 8-year-old I could have handled that. Yeah. That's amazing. Well, now that you have your own family, I mean, did that inform how you handle things with your kids? Do you take the same approach different?
I wasn't that. I mean, I didn't expect them when they were 8 to do that. And actually, one of the challenges that I've had a bit is that when you've grown up in a family where money is very, very constrained. I mean, we slept on mattresses on the floor for the first year we were in New Zealand. Then my dad, they saved money, and my dad kind of built the beds and things like that. But then, because of the wonderful benefits that New Zealand gave to me, I ended up with a wonderful education and was able to build a career. And it meant that my financial circumstances with my children were quite different to those that I was growing up in. But I've always, I've always sort of gone down the approach of allowances to the kids and expecting them to live within their means, expecting my kids to work as they've got older. I mean, they're all kind of 20 and above now, but expecting them to get jobs and manage for themselves and really talk about money. And I think that the important conversation that I've had with my children, and I've got 2 sons and a daughter, and I've had it equally with all 3 of them, that really stuck with me from childhood was, you have to assume throughout your life that no one else is going to support you and your children financially. And that's been a core message that I have given my kids, and it was a core message that was given to me.
That's really interesting. Hugh, you also have a family. I mean, how do you approach this sort of quite tricky conversation with your kids, and what's the right age to start having these conversations?
Yeah, well, I suppose I had a slightly different upbringing. It was, maybe you could call it a charmed childhood. Our family had a reasonable amount of money. We weren't, probably you'd call us middle class, but I grew up in a family that was quite focused on the church, and so we were very exposed from a young age to families that had very little. But equally, we'd go on holiday occasionally and see these grand residences around the country as we drove past, and Mum would always say under her breath, "drug money," and
that made you really interested in a certain type of career?
So I think I became aware that there was a kind of a spectrum of opportunities and existences out there. But it was really, interestingly, it was always the women in my life who sort of brought that perspective on how to manage money. And my mother, I suppose, occasionally came out with a large ledger book where she did a budget. And, it was one of those things that I wasn't entirely sure what it was for, but it was obvious from that actually money was something you had to think about and plan. It wasn't just something that fell out of trees and landed in your lap. So I think that's something I learned from a young age, that actually in a partnership, in a fairly stable family environment, it's actually a partnership where different people bring different experiences and different capabilities to the table, and I think it's really important to do that. I think rolling forward, I have two teenage boys now. I was very focused on them thinking about savings, and actually one situation that happened quite recently was my oldest son. He is quite good at managing his money and very good at savings. I was very proud of his ability to put money away and put away his pocket money. And then one day he just came out and decided that he wanted to buy himself a watch, and I was absolutely horrified. I was thinking, surely you're saving for your retirement, And but actually, on reflection, I was really pleased that he had actually thought about the whole process of, okay, I get some pocket money, I have a few jobs here and there, I've collected some, and now actually I want to spend it on something that I've really thought about and I really value. And so he was well ahead of me, actually, and I was quite proud with his money maturity. He talked about it with us, he went and did what he did, and it was a great outcome. So I think it is about giving the kids control. We're trying to empower them, not control them. And I think what I learned out of that is that actually he'd managed to become empowered with his money. So I was very proud of that.
I love that perspective of empowerment, not control. I mean, when you look back at your own money journey, I think all of us have a money journey. We're not born knowing how it works. Do you have any regrets that you try to help the next generation avoid?
Yeah, actually, I think I may have shared the story with Frances already, so I think I know where she's going. But no, look, my same mother, actually, I only have one, gave me another lesson early in my life by selling me her Briley shares pretty much at the top of the market. And that was my life savings as it existed at the time. And I think they went from, I'm guessing, $3.20 to 32 cents within a very short period of time. And I suppose that's really relevant these days, because I think what wasn't available in those days was micro-investing and learning by doing. And now, I have children who can go out and put $1 on Rivian or Tesla or someone and learn about savings, learning about diversification, learning about all of these things that in the past you had to do by getting a financial advisor and putting it all on red or black. I think this is I learned a lot from that, but equally that's a lesson that they won't have to learn, luckily.
Never tell me a story in confidence. If I think it's interesting, I'll make you repeat it.
Okay.
Antonia, I think it's something that all of us can identify with, really, that many of our first experiences with money are shaped by our parents, right? I mean, did you have money conversations with your parents?
Yes, absolutely. My mother was someone who was told she was no good at maths at school, so never sort of continue with maths. But interestingly, she's been an investor. She's a way more, I'd call myself a lazy investor. I'm happy with the managed fund and the diversification. She's actually an active investor, still at just turned 80. And so things like the miracle of compound interest. She told me that when I was probably 12. I mean, that's quite an extraordinary theory to learn. And I think one of the things, we talk about financial literacy and education. There's only about 5 things you probably need to teach children. Pay off your highest interest debt first, save for a rainy day. There's not actually many philosophies that you need to know to know what you need to get ahead. So definitely my mother did. Other things they did, we were probably more in Hugh's position. My parents could have afforded for me to buy me the roller skates, but I had to make a co-payment. So if the roller skates were $100, I had to pay the $50 or whatever it was at that time. Maybe it was less because my experience, like the ministers, was we got double our age pocket money, so that was 12 cents, and we were allowed to spend 5 cents, which actually bought a lot of lollies in those days. But there was a whole, this whole thing about here's your contribution. The Seminal family event we had when I was young was a trip to California when I was 12, so that was 1982. And our spending money was earned by doing chores. And if we did special chores that, or we were very good on the day, we got the money tripled, and otherwise we got the money doubled at the end of whatever we'd earned. And that was all we had to spend. This is 1982. I mean, a Kiwi kid in America, it's like a great big candy store. There's so much stuff they didn't have. But what we had was stuff that we'd earned before we left, and that was our envelope of spending money. So there were lots of little things over the course of time that was instilled to us by my parents, but in particular my mother. And I think that's probably an unusual situation for those days, or even now, that my mother's been the active investor through my parents' savings and now retirement.
Oh, good on her. I remember having a slightly cheeky conversation once with a political type who once said, "Oh, but how do you keep saying the same thing over and over again in different ways? How do you pretend to say it differently?" Excuse me. There's lots to talk about in personal finance. But, what about yourself? Regrets that you would like to avoid passing on?
I had probably not regrets, but I had a similar situation to Hugh. I had a portfolio that probably had, and this was again Mum, he every so often would be $500 worth of Golden Bay Cement shares. It had Briley, it had Chase, it had Equity Corp. You might say with 6 shares in there it was diversified. It was very diversified towards companies that collapsed in 1988. So that was I guess a lesson in a diversification. I think that's something that people have got now, is that ability to, with a small amount of money, diversify in a way that I just couldn't. I was just carried away on this wave of investing, and I think if we'd known better what long term is about and about fundamentals of companies and things in those days, I think there would have been a lot more attention from media on some of the behaviour in the 80s. So I think we've learned a lot, which I think is very, very positive.
Yes, that 80s crash is still something that gets brought up to me all the time. People were scarred by that. Rhiannon, one thing I think that's undeniable when we're talking about women's experiences with money is the motherhood penalty. That really hits women's earning capability, their saving capability. What was your experience in that area?
Thanks, Frances. Yeah, I've got 3 kids who I had in 3.5 years, so I just kept on going on maternity leave. And I can kind of, I actually talk about my career punctuated by if I actually showed up at work or I was at home or not. So yeah, it was quite, the first time round I think I managed to save a bonus and go through and sort of glide through, and the parental leave, even 8.5 years ago, that's the eldest, was a lot different actually in a government way, and even what employers would support was very different even 8 years ago. So I managed to get through with a bonus. I sort of quite merrily made myself redundant second time round. I said, you don't really need me, and sort of that got me through. But the third time, because I was back again, I had nothing saved at all. So things were pretty tight, which was good. It re-taught me budgeting to a certain extent, because with my career, I sort of, I very similar stories to Samantha, allowances given, and, I was given money every quarter by my parents. That teaches you a reasonable amount about sort of, how to really kind of make it go through. So that I got really good at sort of, taking things out of my online shopping basket and so forth to kind of make sure that I could, keep within a budget each week and keep the household going.
That must have been really tricky. That's just one after the other, the financial hits. I mean, does it still
poorly planned?
Does it still shape how you handle money now? Did it change things in your household?
I think we always got an eye on sort of how you invest and save for the future and so forth. So I think I'm hoping not. I'm not planning any more children, so hopefully I won't have that sort of gap. But I think getting back, and I think one of the things that did influence is sort of my views around parental leave as well. These days you can already share parental leave, which is great, but I think that one of the penalties is that it does tend to be the mothers who stay home, which makes sense for lots of reasons. But I think one of the parental leave changes we made at Kiwi Wealth recently, along with contributing through periods of parental leave, is trying to really even up the primary and secondary caregiver parental leave, and try and make sure that generally secondary caregivers are fathers, that they feel they can spend time at home, and so that by the time you get back to the workforce things are a little bit more even, because I think that really helps on the longer term motherhood penalty.
Yeah, I've got to say, I mean, I've just had a child myself, and his dad took over from the 7-month mark.
Yep.
And it was night and day for their relationship. They already had a great relationship, but it was so important for our family, as well as the finances.
Yes.
It was nice for me to be able to go back to work. I quite enjoyed. I've got to say, if the sector is coming together to create change, right? I mean, everything we've just talked about now shows how much our personal experiences of money also shapes how we approach it as an industry. I mean, Samantha, if we're going to try to tackle these things as an industry, should we be starting to try getting into people's homes, and how do you even do that?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a massive advantage if in the home you've got two things that are going on, whether this is happening as adults or as children. The first is that you grow up in a family where finances are openly spoken about. So you're sitting around the dining room table and you hear your parents talking about, their next career move or training to improve their places chances in the workplace, or what they want to be doing to saving for retirement. So that creates a whole, if you're growing up in that environment where money is spoken about confidently, that is a fantastic starting point for as you go into adulthood. And the second family conversation, which we've alluded to, is the one around how you share not just the responsibilities when you become parents, but how you share financial well-being. And there are some really, I thought some of the conversations earlier today about how you equalise pension contributions, not just during parental leave, but if there is a choice over whether the father or the mother, or a combination of both, choose to work part-time or work flexibly in some way. Those are family conversations that ideally will be taking place in the family. If they're not taking place in the family, then I think we need to be thoughtful on how we can replicate those kinds of conversations, how we can create opportunities for women to have the opportunity to participate in the types of conversations, and young women to participate in the types of conversations that are going to get them thinking about the choices that they have in front of them that may have incredibly impactful consequences for their long-term financial well-being. And that was why I really like, some of the work around the campaign's been absolutely fantastic, and creating safe spaces. There are things that we can do in the workplace to create opportunities for women to come and sort of talk about, their finances and create opportunities to be confident. But it's around the interventions at the right time when you're making the life choices that will have an impact on your financial well-being. And ideally, those will happen naturally within the family, but we can't assume that they will. And therefore, I think we need to be proactive and thoughtful about what we can do as an industry, what we can do as employers to create those opportunities for women.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've just had a really good question come through Slido, and I'm going to send it your way, Hugh, because I think we always ask women this question, and we very rarely hear from men on it. So the question is, could any of the panellists please comment on how they have juggled having young children and also trying to do well in their career? Hugh, was that a consideration for you?
Clearly you know the answer already, right? So I think we've got a problem here, and I think that I take it back to a point that Rob made earlier, which I think is really valid, that we need to have conversations and normalise behaviour through conversation and through talking about these things. I mean, I suppose in my family, my wife works, she's a GP, she took time off for the two children. I mean, we were quite fortunate that we both of us actually took breaks to shift to the UK and shift back from the UK and shift to France. So we kind of lined that up and with some larger breaks in both of our careers at times when the kids were young. So that kind of helped. But I don't think I'd be sitting here and saying that I took an equal weight in raising the kids. It's clearly uneven and probably still now, to be honest. But I think the way to address that is actually through normalisation and it's not just within the house. I don't think. I think that these are, whether it's talking about gender equality around money topics, or anything else, it really has to be normalised outside the house, between men and women, and just having those conversations. I think the other thing that's really interesting is that as an industry, financial services has sort of been moving even more so into an individualistic paradigm where we sort of assume everyone makes their own choices and has to be individually educated and individually empowered. But actually, we're social animals. We don't operate like that. No one does. And it doesn't matter how sophisticated an investor you are, you're always, if you're making a big choice, you have a chat with someone about it. And I think we need to bring more of that into the way that we structure our industry, the products that we create, the way that we're regulated. We were talking earlier about a scheme that we run in the Pacific Islands, and actually an iwi scheme that we run as well, where we're striking problems with AML because we're being asked to identify that individual and on the assumption that that individual is making the decisions, when really they're not. They're a family, it's a whānau, or it's a group who are making decisions. So I think there's some structural issues around the way we think about money and the way we think about gender equality, where actually let's start thinking about family units, let's start thinking about communities, friends. How do we work together to solve these problems as a team rather than individuals? And whether it's you or me doing something, it needs to be us doing it, I suppose. So that's a long-winded way of saying I'm not pulling my weight.
Can we tell your wife?
Yeah.
Well, yeah, I think, Rhiannon, to link together the points that both Hugh and Samantha have made there, I mean, to get into the home and have those conversations is difficult but important. To try and do things like reduce the motherhood penalty, really important. I mean, what can employers do on this front, do you think? What can people in the industry do? What are some meaningful steps people can start to bring in?
And this is for bringing to reduce the motherhood penalty. I think mean, this becomes a more sort of, a talk about gender and women in the workplace. I think flexible work makes a lot of difference. I think actually one of the silver linings of 2 years of COVID, which has not been at all fun, is that remote working has become so much more acceptable and normal. And so I sort of often say to our staff, like, I don't think I could do this job if we didn't have an absolutely flexible workplace policy, which obviously I get to set. But the whole culture of just, it doesn't matter where you are and where you're working and so forth. So, I can do the school drop. I turn up, as I said, I'm going to sound like a terrible CE. Anyway, I turn up about 9:15 into the office. And until very recently, I left at 4:30 every day to get my son out of daycare. But I would, sadly log on in the evenings and catch up on the hours. But if I had to do a school pickup like I did, it makes no difference, right? Because you can just log onto the Teams meeting and everyone, it doesn't matter where anybody is these days. And I think women in general, have really benefited more from that ability to be where you need to be, and for no one really to blink an eye, I think has been really helpful.
Oh, absolutely. I think the number of women that I talk to who have been available to access the work from home, the flexible hours, huge difference. I mean, Antonia, what actions do you think, this whole campaign has been about starting with action. So what actions do you think the industry can take to start improving that financial confidence, the financial well-being, and making sure that women do have not only a seat at the table, but feel empowered to be there?
Several actions, but before I go into them, there's one thing I'll add to what Rhiannon was saying, is that we've had a policy called, it was like hashtag all roles flex since about 2013, 2012. And lots of people have said to me since COVID, it's great to be able to work home for a couple of days a week. And I go, well, you've always been able to do that. It was just a matter of having a conversation with your manager. What's changed? And it is that COVID has given people the confidence. And even for me, I know I can do it now. I sort of didn't really realise how the technology worked and how easy it was. So I think that's made an enormous difference. But what else can we do? I mean, in terms of improving women's financial wellbeing overall, close the gender pay gap. So shine a light on it. We reported ours as part of the Mind the Gap initiative for the first time this year, and what gets measured gets managed, and our staff should be holding us to account for closing that over time. It's 22% gap in favour of men, because there are more men in technology, senior technology roles, institutional roles, the types of roles around the bank that get paid more, and that's not good enough. Making sure that we're encouraging people and understanding what encourages women to succeed. We did a piece of research towards the end of last year called Watch Women Win, and it used sports, but it applies equally across business into, what is it? Things like encouragement was really important for women. Fear of failure was something that held them back. So making sure that we understand those things and we can help address them with women. Make sure we keep the good policies. Things like employer contributions to KiwiSaver. We've been doing that for years and years now. I mean, if there's something for action for anyone whose company doesn't do that, start lobbying for it. I mean, you do it as well. You've got 2 companies at least, if not more, that you can point to and say they do it. Why can't we? And the other thing is just keep role modelling it. If you can't see it, you can't be it. So make sure we're role modelling good financial well-being, role modelling for our children, for those of us who have them. I think the school thing is really important, because you can't have that ongoing assumption that everyone's parents have got the capability to do that at this stage. But if we do it in schools, then when they're parents, they'll have the capability. And as employers, we can do that as well.
I'd like to pick up on that point you mentioned there about people not knowing they could ask to work from home. I mean, it's such a culture issue, isn't it? Technically it's there. Technically you can do it, but the culture to ask for it and to do it, that's another thing entirely. Do you think it's difficult shifting the dial on culture, and how do we do that? Yeah,
it is really difficult, and it's sort of this presenteeism argument, and I think part of shifting the culture is celebrating and role modelling it. So we will highlight the men at work who are taking part of the parental leave and put the articles on the website and all that sort of thing, just to show that people are doing it. I've never heard one man that's shared the parental leave that hasn't had an amazing experience, just like you've talked about with your husband, Francis. There's just these. You get the embedding in your children's early life. So I think it's part of it is also making sure that, again, showing off what is being done and what people are doing, and having them talk about the experience they've had.
Yeah, my husband and my son are such little bros now. I think I'm going to regret this later on. They're going to team up against me. All right, now there's some really good questions coming through. Please do keep sending them on Slido as you think of them. I'm going to skip down the line and get all of you to answer this just briefly. What are you doing as CEOs to increase long-term financial sustainability for your employees? So we'll start with you, Antonia, and skip on down.
Ooh, long-term financial sustainability for employees. So part of it is, again, sort of the internal campaign. So we had a little deck of cards called I think it was called the Deck of Wellbeing, that had, it was just full of tips of what are better ways to improve your wellbeing. We use the same tips to, send messages through using our, emails and various tools that we have to our customers. So those sort of things is recognising what are the key things behind financial wellbeing, and I mentioned some of them before, and making sure that you're not just using them on behalf of your customers, but you're using them for your staff as well. Little things like, if interest rates go down, don't change your mortgage payments. That can have a huge long-term impact, and it's about demonstrating what that impact can be.
Rhiannon, what about you?
Gosh, that's a scary question. I'm worried I'm going to fall short. So yeah, absolutely. I mean, things like making sure that we're contributing to people during parental leave, but lots of people don't take parental leave. I think that pay parity and pay equity thing is something that we're doing a lot of work on, and I agree. Our pay equity gap now is 28%, so a little bit larger than yours. We actually publish that internally, and I need to do the rest of the maths to actually put it onto Mind the Gap. So kind of putting that out there, we actually have gender pay parity in Kiwi Wealth. So if you're doing the same job as a guy, you're basically almost guaranteed to be paying the same. So if you look at the bands, sometimes women are actually paid more in some bands than other bands. So it's broadly equal, but it is that kind of trying to get women into some of those roles that are actually tend to be better paid in the more senior areas, or in our business it's in investments, the actual investment management team obviously get well remunerated, as do the tech people. So listening to Antonia, I was thinking the same. We do an awful lot about educating our customers. We probably don't do enough taking that incredible external comms and saying internally, have you read this and do you understand this, and are you reading about the great work that we do? So I think it's probably a bit of a challenge and something to take away.
Yeah, good point. Samantha, how about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and throughout my career, there have been two things that have been really important to me as I've kind of moved into a senior executive career. I've been passionate, actually, about making the most of my opportunities as a senior leader and as a chief executive to really tackle two things that I think hold women back in the workplace, and to kind of really bring those into practice in the workplaces that I run. The first is to bring a very strong awareness that men on the whole are noisier when it comes to asking for salary increases and package increases, and to bring that proactively into my oversight and the oversight that I expect of when you're doing your annual pay reviews, or if things come up during the year, to be aware that on the whole men are noisier and women are less noisy about being asked for the pay rise, and to say, actually, my competencies have really increased this past year, I deserve this. So I think as an employer, bringing that very openly, proactively into your view of pay across the workforce is really important. The second thing that is really important, and I have used every opportunity I have had, and it's getting back to not actually just the motherhood cost, but also generally women tend to be the caregivers. So I've worked in jurisdictions where women have played a very important role in caring for elderly parents, much more than men have, and so flexibility is really important, but also a combination of thinking that because I've got these caring responsibilities, or actually, even worse, I don't have confidence in my abilities. It's the whole imposter syndrome. So I'm always looking for always looking for opportunities to have the right conversations, and to make sure the right conversations are having with women in the workplace. So things like I have sort of one example, but there are many where women have chosen not to apply for a promotion just as they're on the cusp of going on to parental leave. And I said, well, actually, why wouldn't you apply for the promotion? Well, I'm just about to go on parental leave. Well, that doesn't mean that you're not the best person to apply for the job, so apply for the job. We'll manage the time that you're away. So I think those are really, and it sort of gets back to the point I was making before. I think that with a very strong consciousness of what it is that can hold women back in their long-term financial well-being, and bringing that into being quite proactive in the workplace and really trying to kind of get a better result.
Absolutely. All right, Hugh, what about you?
I would go back to, I suppose, one thing that I'm fascinated by and really working quite hard on is how we land after COVID. To your point, Antonia, I suppose we had flexible working arrangements before COVID. I think 10% of our staff had a formal flexible working arrangement, but they were people, I suppose what tended to happen was that those people who were working outside the office were kind of excluded or forgotten or disconnected some way, so it made it hard for things like promotion and bringing people along. And so it was sort of almost, it's been fantastic to see those people actually be reconnected and to have an opportunity to take steps in their career. And what I really want to ensure is that we don't go backwards as we come back out of COVID. That I'm sure all of your organisations you'll know people who are kind of champions for going back, and I think we don't want to lose that. And there's so many people that have had opportunities, and particularly women with who want to have more flexibility, who I've seen progress amazingly through this period. So that's one thing that I'm both doing and want to continue to do. I think the other thing, to Rhiannon's point, is that our organisations do have functions that are more highly paid, and particularly the investments area, and so that's something that we're doing in our organisation, is to try and really grow our own capabilities in that space and bring people through. Now we have to be patient. That these things take time, and we have responsibilities to our investors, and we have to get things right. But that's not to say that we can't take that time. I mean, I'm a sort of patient guy, and if it takes us 10 years, then I think there are parts of this problem that we have to accept will take time, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't be moving on them constantly. But if it takes 10 years or 20 years, there will be things that take that long, and let's just keep moving with them. There are some quick wins, but there are some long-term stuff. Don't forget the long-term. I think the other thing for me is that we're not alone. That we're talking about this from a New Zealand context, but there's some fantastic work done by the OECD, and particularly their paper last year, where they have a checklist basically for how do you solve this problem, and I think we should all be using that information, not trying to reinvent the wheel in New Zealand. That there are things that we can do that have been solved elsewhere. Let's copy the best from other jurisdictions and bring that into New Zealand. So I'd encourage everyone to read that paper, and even some of the papers referenced in that as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Samantha, something that you mentioned in your answer there, I'd love to pick up on a bit more. When you talked about, women sometimes not wanting to put themselves forward for opportunities, or, that you have to be quite proactive because they're maybe not as noisy. And I think one of the things that is difficult but needs acknowledging is sometimes women hold themselves back because they've had bad experiences. The dreaded label of being bossy, which doesn't get applied equally, So whether it's in the workplace or with your finances in general, how can we create an environment where women can become a bit noisier and can push for themselves and not be scared of sometimes hitting those ramifications?
Yeah. Oh gosh, yes. I mean, the number of times I was called shrill around a table when I was younger. So there are whole just different adjectives that get applied to you that are always pejorative. So it's difficult. I actually think it's tough being one of the few women in a very male environment. And my advice to women and unless it is a work environment where you've got people, you've got men who are very aware and are very supportive of bringing women forward, then my advice is to kind of look for support outside. And I think that's and as an industry, that's something that we can be thoughtful about. I think the answer is frankly in bringing more women into senior positions in the workplace, so that you're creating a kind of an easier environment for women to be themselves in the workplace. I mean, I ran when I was in Gibraltar, as the chief executive of the Financial Services Commission there, we had 50% of senior leaders were women, and at the senior leadership team, 4 out of 5 of us were women, and that just created a completely different environment for women to not just survive but thrive. Whilst I've got the microphone, I just wanted I just wanted to sort of pick up on the discussion on flexibility, and I completely agree with everything that's been said around what we've learned through COVID. The one thing I'm quite thoughtful on, and I'm just kind of going to be aware of at the back of my mind when I'm looking at how do we foster and nurture women in the workplace, is I've got a slight concern that if women have more ability to work flexibly from home, that actually the overall amount of work they do, not just their paid work, but their unpaid work, is going to increase. And I am concerned about that. And I haven't, in the work that I was doing in the UK just before I came here, I saw that happening. I saw women were continuing to hold down full-time roles, working flexibly, but were exhausted because they were doing more of the school runs, more of the trips to the dentist, more of the supermarket runs at 1 a.m, because the supermarkets are open that often in the UK. And I know actually from my own experience working full time, I remember being on my knees at times, not because I couldn't work flexibly. I was, when I was younger and when my kids were younger, but I remember at various points just being on the verge of giving up because I was so tired. And so I just think when we talk, it's not we just need to be aware that we may be increasing the work that women do may increase as a result of this new flexibility that we have found as a result of COVID.
Hopefully the work that men will do might come and fill
You'd
some
like
of
to
that
think
gap,
so.
because they'll be
Yeah.
able to do it at home as well.
Yeah, you'd like to think so.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
Yeah, well, I think that's an excellent point. And as well, we've had a question come here on Slido, which I'd like to send your way, Hugh, because of that work that you... I know, it's not another trick question, don't worry. The work that you've done getting Kiwi Saver into the Pacific Islands and with the iwi program, I think it's really relevant here. So Ainsley said, as it's hard to be what you cannot see, do you have any suggestions for how we reach the most vulnerable in our society? How difficult is it getting into different communities and coming across challenges that you don't expect when we're sometimes looking at things a little one-size-fits-all, a little mainstream?
Yeah, it is a challenge, and I suppose one of the things that we do at Smartshares is we support a program operated by the Taranaki whānui, led by Te Atiawa and Taranaki iwi, called Ka Uru Ora, where they provide a co-contribution scheme, and I suppose it's really bringing in a set of investors who whakapapa to one of these Taranaki iwi, and many of them have had absolutely no exposure to financial services before, and it's really designed around whānau. So I suppose we had one situation where we had a number of aunties, I suppose, and I see Ivy in the audience and she'll correct me if I've got the details wrong, but really we have situations where family members might want to contribute to their underlying children's accounts. Now, it might be a many-to-many relationship. You know, if we think about the history of pocket money, with your parents giving you pocket money, think about all your aunties giving you $1, and to all of the nephews and nieces. And this group of women came to us and said, we want to set this up for our nephews and nieces. So how do we apply? And can you imagine the multiplication of documents and application forms where you have 6 aunties and 16 nephews and nieces, and the whole thing just is ridiculous. You know, I mean, it was quite simple if you had a blank sheet of paper and wrote a list of the aunties and a list of the children and then said, go for it. It's quite a simple thing. But when we try and force it through our kind of existing paradigm, you know, AML and all of these things, it didn't work. So I think it comes back to, and this is something, you know, that was, I discussed with MB as well in the KiwiSaver review, is that actually, to solve some of these problems, we do need to actually start thinking structurally about, you know, how we support people's financial well-being and try and move away, as I said earlier, from this idea that every man for himself or every woman for themselves. You know, it's actually, we're in this together. The conversations are collective, the solutions are collective. So I'm not sitting up here saying I have the answer, but I think, you know, it's not just about making the existing paradigm work for everyone, you know, the existing products work for women or the existing employment arrangements work. It's actually just standing back a little bit and going, what's the actual problem we're trying to solve, and how do people want to solve it for themselves, and then how do we wrap a regulatory and product environment around that to solve the problem. And you can see with startup companies that that's exactly how they operate. They start with the problem. You know, that Sharesies started with, how do you get someone to, you know, buy a share instead of a cup of coffee? You know, how do you start investing with $5? That was the problem statement, and then they solved it with a solution. How do we? So I would encourage everyone not to start with the current paradigm and say, how do we squash this, you know, problem into the existing?
Absolutely. And another great question that I'm going to send your way, Antonia. Women are typically more in control of finances, yet financial advisors are predominantly male. Any ideas why or how we could improve this? And I'd also add my own. Do you think that's a problem?
I think it probably is a problem, because you're always more comfortable speaking about something with someone who feels a bit more like you, I think, in the circumstances as well. So it would be great if more financial advisors were women, and I think part of that is you know, for the advisor firms and things in the industry is, you know, taking some of the examples we've talked about today, is how do you encourage women into that? Because what was the first part of the question again, sorry?
That women are typically more in control of the finances.
Yeah, because that is just so fascinating. You know, women are in charge of the budget, but they come to invest and they end up with something like, I mean, there's lots of different ways you can cut it, but our numbers would say men might end up with 50% more in their KiwiSaver by retirement, so 180,000 versus 120,000. Now, there's loads of assumptions that go into that, but the broad premise is women earn less over their lifetime, so take more career breaks, and they're more conservative. So I mean, maybe it's that budgeting thing for the family that makes them less willing to be aggressive or go for a growth fund, because they feel like, you know, they've got this, it's important to keep money safe. And I think that's part of the education is, well, what does safety mean? And the fact that retirement savings is long-term savings, and once you know some of the ground rules for it, you can have the confidence to invest a little bit less conservatively. And I think if you had more women in the profession, that would help. But you know, all I can say is, for those who have those in the room that have the ability to influence financial advisors and bringing women into the fold, I mean, what a wonderful thing that women could do for other women, is be part of their financial advice sort of ecosystem.
Yeah. And I would like to say it's fabulous seeing so many women in the room today. So that is, I hope, a sign of things. There's a couple of questions that come through. I'm going to kind of mush them in together and send them your way, Rhiannon, because it's saying, you know, these juggling conversations, and there's the motherhood penalty, and a lot of the conversations about women and money is very tied up with children. And there are, of course, women who choose not to have children. There are women who would like to have their identity a bit more separate from their children. You know, how do we manage all of how do we manage all of that and ensure that we're addressing issues that do impact women, but also taking them seriously as their own entity, not necessarily always with 2 or 3 kids in tow?
Gosh, that's actually quite a difficult question. I think, how does one answer that? I think the reason why we talk about, children with women so often is because, they're not quite a ball and chain, are they? I mean, obviously those who have them find them delightful, as are mine.
Mostly.
Yeah, most of the time. But I think, so I think when you're talking about sort of women in careers and the confidence and so forth, I think that is actually probably much more specific to the gender rather than, children actually kind of holding you back. But I suppose when you think about some of the reasons why women are not progressing into those higher echelons in leadership, for example, it is often because they have a higher weight to carry at home, be it looking after elderly parents or looking after the generation below as well. And I've certainly felt the reality of the sandwich generation as well in recent years, where you're kind of, you're looking up and you are looking down. Sometimes when I look at sort of some of the most amazing, successful women in the kind of generations above me, I think a lot of them actually have not had children as well. So I think it goes to show that you can do an enormous amount if you're actually almost slightly more on a level playing with the men, and you're not having to do that big emotion. You're talking about the kind of what they call emotional labour at home and that household labour. I was sort of smiling wryly to myself to get here this morning. My husband announced that he was also flying at 7 a.m. this morning. I was like, well, I'm flying at 6 a.m. and I'm on a panel and I'm going. And we're like, what are we going to do with the kids? And there are four handlings of the children today that aren't by us. So we got my poor friend Fraser, who's the most equal parent of all time. We dragged him from his family. He looked after our kids from 6:30 a.m. to 7:30 a.m. and then dropped them into this preschool program at the Y, which my children had never done, and they were in complete outrage about it. But they were told it was a one-off. And then my father-in-law's picking them up from school, and then he's handing over to a babysitter at 6 o'clock. So that's also all arranged by me. That's the other interesting thing. It is always my problem to solve. And so actually the other day we got invited to dinner next Tuesday, and Alex thought he was being, I hope he's no one who knows, well, you obviously know him. Anyway, he thought he was being really clever because he was like, I can come to the dinner, but I'll let Rhiannon answer because she's a woman and she can respond by herself. And I said, when Alex finds a babysitter, he'll be available. So it's still like, so it's about, I'm still solving how do both of us get there. So it doesn't really, but I think, with that, it doesn't answer your question that well, but I think the children, I do think, women of course are separate from their children, and as you say, encouraging them when they're about to take parental leave to be like, take the step up, is really important. There's so many things that we can encourage women to be themselves.
And I think to reiterate what Samantha said earlier about always tell women and men, don't feel like you should be relying on someone else for your financial security and long-term. I saw this. I went to a pretty well-known private girls' school in Auckland. I might leave it nameless. And I read their school chronicle at the end of the year a few years ago. A friend's daughter was, had a copy of it. And the 7th form, or whatever you call it now, had all their, what they've done, what they're famous for, what they'd like, what are their aspirations. And so many of them, their aspiration, and it's sort of, tongue-in-cheek, but I want to marry an all-black, I want to marry a rich man. There was literally one who had a career-related aspiration, and it was actually the daughter of one of my colleagues. And I just find that horrifying. And I know there's some fun in being able to say things like that, but it's horrifying that we've got a very well-educated group of 17-year-old women or 18-year-old women who are saying my aspiration is tied to someone else, or my financial security is tied to someone else. I was horrified.
I'm horrified by that. Sorry, that is not a good outcome for that school.
I had to go at the principal, and she's like, oh yeah, but it's all a joke, and 50% of our women are going into STEM subjects next year and that sort of thing. And even then I was like, I bet the STEM subjects you're talking about, I bet they're all going into medicine. They're not going to be engineers and they're not going to be scientists.
So true. And I mean, the thing is as well, to raise your point earlier, Rhiannon, is if there were easy answers to this stuff, I know I've thrown you guys some curveballs, but if there were easy answers to this, we wouldn't all be here today, you know? It's a curly one. And that's horrifying. I don't know how you stayed calm in that session. All right, well, this will have to be the last question for us. I'm going to go down the line again. So how will you and your organisation continue to champion women's financial well-being moving forward? Start with you, Antonia.
Close the gender pay gap, keep looking for ways to promote women so they end up in higher, more well-paid roles, so that will help them with their financial security. What else? Make sure that we keep the policies going so that women are thought about, and that those of us who are nervous about raising our hands and saying I can do this job are actually thought about and encouraged, and keep role modelling.
Yeah, I think the role modelling is very important, isn't it? Especially for that culture change that we talked about before. How about you, Rhiannon?
I was going to say ditto, which is sort of a bit, but I mean, absolutely, it is sort of bringing, and I think to add to what Antonia has said, really driving that pipeline of women through the organisation, particularly, we're trying to really recruit into our investment management team to try and make sure that's sort of more 50-50, at least at those earlier levels. It's very hard in the more senior levels of investment management because it's just the talent pool isn't out there to we're not going to solve this problem overnight, but we are very conscious in our hiring policies and so forth at that bottom level. But yeah, we're obviously trying to ensure that we what gets measured get done. I felt that the pay equity gap at Kiwi Wealth I was quite shocked, given we're 50-50 male-female, and I felt that we had a lot of senior representation from women in the organisation, so I was really shocked at the level of that gap. So it does concentrate the mind somewhat. Just continuing these steps. I think the action that this campaign has started is so fantastic, and I've been really heartened in particular by the collaboration across the industry. The fact that clearly when you guys, FSC, went out there, everyone was like, yeah, we're just so into that, and I think it's really cool. So, as you say, continuing that momentum, it doesn't stop with this summit or this campaign, we keep going.
Absolutely. Samantha.
Thanks. I'm going to say ditto and then add that one of the huge opportunities that we have at the FMA, our remit's expanding into being really a full conduct regulator and to consumer protection with the, for example, we will be authorising and supervising banks, insurance companies for their conduct. And what that does is, for us, it provides us with a tremendous opportunity to, as an organisation, to really focus our regulation on working with the industry to make sure that the financial services sector is working well for all New Zealanders, and that it is a sector that enables all New Zealanders to not just survive but thrive. And that places a big responsibility on us, which we are embracing. We've got some research that will be coming out next week to raise issues, to look at the experience of all New Zealanders, so the experience of women, the experience of Maori, Pacifica in New Zealand's financial services, and really champion the fact, an outcome whereby as I said, the financial services sector is working well for all New Zealanders, and in very much including women.
How about you, Hugh?
At Smartshares, we have the privilege of administering and managing more than 200 workplace savings schemes for New Zealand companies, and I think there's an opportunity for us to work with, I suppose, to review those. I'm thinking about the checklists of scheme design in this OECD report, where it actually gives some ideas for changes to plan structures to actually make them more gender neutral or more supportive of women. And so there's an opportunity for us to actually go through that list and say, okay, well, where do we see opportunities to recommend to these employers to make changes to their scheme? So I think we can have a bigger, we have work to do in our own shop, as we've discussed, but I think we can also actually have a bigger impact by working with our employer clients. So we'll be taking that away, and luckily Ivy and Donna are in the room, and they lead that. So we have really, some really good leadership, women leadership into that workplace savings scheme. So that we'll take that one away.
Well, thank you all so much for your time, your thoughts. I think there's a lot of food for thought after this session, and importantly, a lot that can actually be turned into action, because that is the important thing. Nobody wants just another talk fest. It really does start with action. That's why it's called this. So can we all join me in giving them a big thank you?
Before you go, panel, I've got 3 observations and I've got 3 thank yous. So one is, as individuals, for the conversations that you're having with your families and your friends, because it is an individual conversation. Thank you all as CEOs of your businesses and sharing with us today what you're doing in your businesses and your companies, and a few challenges that have been put out there, and empowering us to go and have those conversations with our employers if they're not happening. But also thank you for being leaders in the industry and being part of this discussion. And as I've said, it's day one, and you're contributing to day one, and it's going forward. Samantha, I'd like to say that I'm noisy, so I'm bucking the trend here, and I'll continue to be noisy. So thank you for encouraging us to be noisy as well. Out of the Slido questions, we have 92 ideas that have come out of the 200 at 9:22 a.m. So we're halfway there. So it's an hour on now. I haven't checked in with Anna, but we need to get those 200 ideas coming through. Please take your money cards with you now when you go for your morning tea. I will be observing to see if those conversations do take place. And for those of you that did register with dietary requirements, please go and see the staff out there, and they'll head you towards the dietary options table. And then finally, I'll see you back here at 10:55 on the button. So thank you very much.